Hi everyone, today we are going to talk about the SP500 and the GDP. So if we just plot the GDP, the gross domestic product, here in orange, and SP500, we can see that they both go up over those last 60 years, 50, 70 years. And we can see slight correlation. So for example, when the GDP was going down during the financial crisis in 2008, we also had a market crash in the S&P. Here I'm using data from the Federal Reserve, which is here the GDP, which is seasonally adjusted and inflation adjusted. So we seems to see kind of a correlation. So let's have a look a bit more into this correlation. Now if we look at basically if we plot now, instead of plotting the nominal value, if we plot the year over year, so basically the yearly return of the S&P 500 and the percentage change year over year of the GDP, we see that they look quite similar. Indeed, we see that usually the S&P 500 is spiking before the GDP. So here, before the GDP was going down, we already had a market crash. So, and sorry, here this one is not lagged. So here there is no lag. Now if so there is kind of, we kind of see that the S&P 500 moves before the GDP. So what happens if we just move this time the S&P 500 by 6 months? So basically we just shifted this curve 6 months into the future. And now we see that the spikes are aligned. So basically what it means that it seems that the S&P 500 moves 6 months before the GDP moves. We could actually look more specifically into correlation. So we are going to look at those two time series and check the correlation. And we can actually check for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months lags. Basically from 0 to 12 months lag. And then here on the y-axis we can look at the correlation with the GDP variation. And you can see that there is actually the highest correlation is around 6 months lag or even 7 months lag. So yeah, it seems that there is really a correlation between the GDP and the S&P. But was this correlation stable over time? And first, before asking this question, another way to look at this correlation is just to plot a scatter plot of the S&P and the GDP year over year. So for example, in July 2020, this is actually an outlier, but let's take like very common points. So for example, in April, in 1955, the S&P 500, like by 6 months, was growing by 29%, and the GDP was growing by 6%. So you see that when the GDP return is positive, usually the S&P is also positive. Of course, we have few outliers, as I was pointing out. For example, we have the COVID crisis here, where the rolling year-over-year GDP was down 9%, but the S&P was up 20%. And this was due to a very large Fed intervention on the financial market with quantitative easing and low interest rates and also stimulus. And here we have the mirror point in a sense, but this is less of an outlier because here we have the rebounds of the GDP by 12%, and we actually have also the S&P going up still one year later after basically the beginning of the recovery. So yes, that's also another way to see the correlation. As you can see, there is kind of a linear trend here that we could eventually regress. So now, was this correlation stable over time? So to answer this question, we could look at the 10 years rolling correlation of the GDP with the S&P, like by different months. So you can see that correlation here was at some point, most of the time it was above 40% correlation, but then sometimes we had really low correlation, like 0% correlation, or even negative correlation. There is a bit too many curves on this one. Maybe we can pick only few. Let's take the 3, 6 and 9 months lag, and you can identify for example the COVID crisis here, where the correlation was really low, and we can also identify the high inflation period of the beginning of the 80s, where the correlation also dropped. So basically, when the Fed intervene on the market, it can change the correlation. So it's not true all the time, basically. Yes. Another way to visualize this is it's basically almost the same data, but visualized another way. So here on the y-axis we have the time, and every column is a different lag, and the color is basically the correlation. So when it's red, it means that it has high correlation, a high rolling 5 years correlation between the GDP and the S&P 500 with a lag of 6 months, for example. So you can see that yes, the lag of 6 months was, or 6 or 7 months, was the lag that had most of the time the highest correlation. We can see here in 2022 that we start, so here we have the decorrelation due to the Fed and the stimulus, and here we start to increase in terms of correlation. So that's what we're going to do here by zooming out. So this is since 2010. This is nominal GDP on the right axis in orange, and in blue you have the S&P 500. And here I did shift it by 5 months to align those two spikes. So you can see that for the COVID crash, actually the S&P was predicting, he had less time in a sense to predict the GDP, which makes sense because it was a sudden event which changed a lot of things. So here you see we went from 6-7 months to 5 months lag on this specific event. Now if we look at today, basically the S&P 500 is still growing by a rolling factor of what, 30% per year? Is it that high? It's crazy. And the GDP is also growing by 5% per year. So yes, I would say that the market is actually expecting the GDP to continue to grow in a sense. But we need to put into consideration that we still have quite some stimulus and Fed intervention still today. Yeah. Another way to look at it is to check from a binary perspective. So when we have a growth of the GDP, in 60, so basically there are 4 possibilities. Either you have growth of the GDP and of the S&P 500, either you have growth of the GDP but the SP is down, or you have recession but the S&P is up, or you have recession and the S&P is down. So basically what is interesting to see is that in this case here, it's not lagged. We have in 69% of the case they move both up. When one moves up, the other one moves up also. And false, that means when they go both down, so in 3% of the case. So here about 73% of the case they move in the same direction. Now if we look at this from with a 6 months lag, you can see that here we have 70% of the case plus let's say 7%, so let's say about of there is on average it moves in the same direction 80% of the case. And when it doesn't, it's usually because you have profit taking. So basically the GDP is still up, but the SP is down. And this is basically moment when you have volatility in the market where you are basically, it's like, it's the market is taking profit and before and usually continuing the trend. So let's conclude this video. So I was saying, in 80% of the case, the GDP and the S&P 500, like by 6 months, goes in the same direction. There is a correlation of about 50%, which is actually a quite high correlation from a statistical point of view. What does it mean? It means that if you can predict the GDP more than 6 months in advance correctly, you have an edge in the market. That's an interesting fact, but you need to be, so predicting the GDP 6 months in advance is quite difficult, of course, but with some good macroeconomics and some early indicator, you might be able to have a slight bias and therefore implement a bias in your long-short portfolio. What else? Mm, so what's really interesting is that, as you see and as you can expect, the stock market is really forward-looking, and the GDP is lagging, of course, because it needs to be published, and it's published after 1 month of the quarter. It's also usually readjusted also. But the 6 months is something that you need to keep in mind. The stock market is usually right 6 months before the GDP. So that means that if you want to beat the market, you need to have an horizon of being right in the next 6 months or more, I would say. And how is it explained? It is explained by basically the fact that the gross domestic product, the economic activity, is actually driving the earnings. The earnings drive the S&P, and the S&P try to predict the GDP before it's released. So thanks for your attention. Please like and subscribe to the channel. If I have some likes and subscribes, I might continue. If I don't, I might stop. And please check in the description below how to download my notebook if you want to have a look. It's actually automatically downloading the data from the Fed, and yes, thanks a lot for your attention. Please like.